Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into the mind of someone who truly shook things up in his own time and continues to challenge how we think about freedom, society, and even ourselves. We're tackling Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah, a figure often called an intellectual godfather of the French Revolution, and definitely a major player in the whole social contract theory game.
But he wasn't afraid to be the outsider. Right. His work starts with a statement that just immediately tells you he's not playing by the usual rules of the Enlightenment.
Absolutely. He opens his most famous book, The Social Contract, with a line that just, well, it grabs you.
It really does. Man is born free, and yet we see him everywhere in chains. And he doesn't stop there. He adds, those who believe themselves masters of others cease not to be even greater slaves than the people they govern.
And then he throws down the gauntlet, saying, how this happens, I am ignorant. But if I were asked what renders it justifiable, I believe it may be in my power to resolve the question.
That opener is just,
Wow.
especially for the mid-18th century.
Right. Thinkers around him were, generally celebrating reason, progress, expansion of liberty. Locke had laid the groundwork for popular sovereignty, government by consent. The general mood was pretty optimistic about humanity's potential for freedom.
And then Rousseau comes along and says, essentially, nope, you're all still slaves, everywhere in chains.
Exactly. It was a real slap in the face to the prevailing wisdom.
And the text we're using for this deep dive, a fantastic chapter on Rousseau from a work on Western political thought, really zeroes in on that core puzzle.
Well,
If we're supposedly born free, and maybe things seem to be getting freer, why are we actually in chains? And how could those chains possibly be justified?
so our mission today is to really take apart that opening statement. We need to understand Rousseau's incredibly radical explanation for how these chains got there, because he does have an answer, despite that initial claim of ignorance,
Wow.
and then explore his equally radical and sometimes, frankly, unnerving solutions. We're talking about his concepts of the general will and that truly mind-bending idea of being forced to be free.
And get this, the text we're exploring insists on something maybe a bit unexpected. To truly understand Rousseau's political philosophy, it says, you have to understand him.
Yeah, it argues there's this incredibly intimate connection between the man's inner life, his personal struggles, and the massive sweeping claims he makes about society. The text literally says his philosophy is a direct reflection of the man himself, and that his inner and essentially neurotic conflicts have a direct bearing on his political theory.
So we can't just look at the abstract ideas. We need to see how the man and the philosophy are kind of tangled up together. And, you might be surprised by what we find. He's not the simple liberal or Democrat you might guess.
Not at all. His ideas are layered, sometimes seem contradictory, and they absolutely challenge our modern assumptions about freedom and the state.
Okay, so let's start there with the man himself, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in Geneva, 1712, into an artisan family, right? Watchmakers.
That's right. And tragedy struck almost immediately. His mother died just days after his birth. And the text we're using suggests this really cast a long shadow over his life. It might have fueled a lifelong sense of guilt, maybe contributing to the intense, often, neurotic personality he developed.
And unlike a lot of the big thinkers of the era, he didn't have that traditional university education.
No, he was largely self-taught. He spent his youth traveling, working odd jobs, just reading constantly.
Eventually, he lands in Paris in the 1740s, the intellectual hub. And this is where he kind of hooks up with the big names of the French Enlightenment, the philosophes, Diderot, D'Alembert, people like that.
He even contributed articles to Diderot's huge project, the Encyclopédie, including his discourse on political economy, which is a really key text for understanding his thought. That's alongside the first and second discourses, and of course the big one, the social contract.
Plus, he wrote novels like Emile, which is all about education, and his famously revealing autobiography, The Confessions.
But it was the publication of Emile and the Social Contract in 1761 that really set off a firestorm. Our text describes it as a truly disastrous turning point in his personal life.
What happened?
His books were publicly burned in Paris. He faced threats of arrest. Even in Geneva, his cherished hometown, they confiscated them. He was forced to flee, basically becoming a fugitive, a wanderer. The very philosophes who'd welcomed him earlier, they turned on him.
Wow.
Yeah, he became increasingly isolated, paranoid. The text actually says his final years were marked by psychotic depression and paranoia, and he ended his life in madness and despair.
That's incredibly bleak. And the source we're reading, it really insists this personal turmoil isn't just, biographical background. It's deeply connected to the philosophy itself.
Exactly. The text argues that the core of Rousseau's personal struggle was this profound inconsistency between what he preached and how he actually lived. There's a great line in the source. If ever there was a man who could say in all sincerity, "Do as I say, not as I do," it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
And the examples are pretty stark, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. The Confessions lays it bare. He wrote with such intense feeling about his connection to others, yet he was notoriously difficult, treated his long-term partner, Thérèse Levasseur, quite poorly for years before finally marrying her.
And the children.
Right. He wrote Emile, this groundbreaking work advocating for a tutor's absolute dedication to raising a child, guiding their natural development. Yet he fathered several children with Thérèse and abandoned every single one of them to a foundling home. Never saw them again.
That's hard to reconcile.
It really is. And there's more. He attacked civilized entertainment like the theater as artificial and corrupting, but he was an avid theater-goer himself. He called the intellectual life unnatural, famously saying in the second discourse that the man who meditates is a depraved animal, yet he was a thorough intellectual who frequented the very salons he criticized.
He even called the desire for fame a perversion, but seemed desperate for it himself.
Absolutely. He clearly craved recognition. And the text points out he wasn't oblivious to these contradictions. He wrote about them, seemed genuinely puzzled by them.
Did he think he was a hypocrite?
It's complicated. He seemed to believe, maybe neurotically, maybe self-deceptively, that despite all this bad behavior, he was fundamentally a good person inside. The source contrasts his confessions with St. Augustine's. Augustine confesses sin to show his need for grace. Rousseau confesses his flaws almost as a challenge, saying, "Look, here's everything I did wrong, now show me someone who's actually better."
Okay, so how does this personal mess, this inconsistency, feed into the political philosophy?
This is the crucial leap. Rousseau concluded it wasn't just him. This gap between inner feeling and outward action, this inconsistency, was a defining characteristic of all civilized people. And the only explanation he could find, the absence of liberty, the chains.
The chains aren't just like political oppression.
Not just. For Rousseau, when people lose control over their political destiny, they also lose the inner freedom to act according to their natural goodness and decency. Bad behavior wasn't proof people were inherently bad. It was proof they were trapped, enslaved by a corrupt social structure. People behave badly because they are in chains.
Okay, so if civilization puts us in chains, how exactly does that happen? Where do they come from? You mentioned he does have an answer, even though he says, "I am ignorant at first."
Right. The source tells us that despite that opening disclaimer in the social contract, he lays out his case very clearly in the second discourse.
And the culprit is?
Private property, or rather, the inequality produced by the emergence of private property. He paints this picture of primitive people in a state of nature, no property, therefore equal and free. But then someone fences off land, says, "This is mine," and others are naive enough to believe him. That's the beginning of the end.
How so?
Inequality takes root. Social classes develop based on huge disparities in wealth. And according to Rousseau, this destroys liberty in two ways.
Okay, what are they?
First, politically. The propertied classes gain the power to dominate everyone else. Political liberty is lost. But second, and maybe even more insidious for Rousseau, is the loss of personal inner liberty.
How does inequality affect inner freedom?
It breeds competition, he says. Not just for money, but for power, honor, status, things he calls unnatural social desires. These replace natural feelings of cooperation and empathy with envy, malice, conflict. People start calculating everything based on narrow self-interest. They become other-directed, as the source puts it, constantly seeking external approval, obsessed with how others see them, doing anything to climb the social ladder.
And this is where he makes that really radical claim about reason itself becoming corrupted.
Exactly. Reason, in this context of inequality and perverse social desires, becomes perverted. It's no longer a tool for finding truth or living virtuously. It gets used purely to figure out how to get ahead, how to manipulate others. It becomes a source of vanity. People pursue learning just to feel superior.
And worst of all,
civilized people use their corrupted reason to create elaborate philosophical systems, ironically, like those of the Enlightenment thinkers he knew, that actually justify the existing inequalities and the loss of liberty. They build intellectual justifications for their own enslavement, effectively blinding themselves to the chains.
wow. That sounds like the core of his argument in the first discourse, the one that won him that prize but also made him a lot of enemies.
Absolutely. The Academy of Dijon asked whether progress in the arts and sciences had improved morals. Rousseau's winning answer was a blistering no. It was a full-scale assault on the Enlightenment's core faith in reason and progress.
He argued they actually contributed to the loss of freedom.
Yes. He said the arts and sciences were like garlands of flowers draped over the iron chains people wore. They made the chains look pretty, stifled the natural sense of liberty, made men love their slavery, and turned them into these supposedly civilized peoples who were actually less free, less moral, and less happy than their ancestors. That image is so powerful.
So the political conclusion from all this, according to the text, is that European society needs a radical overhaul,
Yeah.
a reconstitution.
Completely. The goal has to be rebuilding society in a way that reunites political liberty and inner freedom. You need political freedom so people can collectively shape a society that encourages their natural goodness rather than corrupting it.
And crucially, this isn't something individuals can just achieve on their own through, like, self-help or moral improvement.
No. Rousseau's own life, his struggles, convinced him that human freedom and fulfillment require a supportive political structure. A good polity makes virtue possible. People act badly despite their innate goodness, he argues, because the social order, built on inequality, forces them into these unnatural, self-interested ways of behaving.
Now, here's a fascinating point our text highlights. Even though he blames private property for kicking off this whole mess of inequality and chains, he doesn't actually call for abolishing it.
Right. He's not a proto-Marxist, even though his critique of property certainly influenced Marx later on. His proposed reforms don't involve getting rid of private property. It's just one example of how his thinking often runs essentially contrary to our normal political assumptions.
Which explains why people interpret him in such wildly different ways. Liberal, totalitarian.
Exactly. He doesn't fit neatly into our usual boxes.
So, to understand the positive vision he offers, the solution to the chains, we need to turn to his contract theory in the social contract.
Yes. The text notes he uses the language of contract theory because, well, that was the dominant political language of his time. Even if his use of it is pretty unconventional, sometimes more metaphorical than literal.
And the starting point, like for Hobbes and Locke, is the state of nature.
Right. And Rousseau's state of nature, as our text describes it, is quite different from theirs. He treats it maybe a bit more like an actual historical condition, though still using logical imagination. He agrees with Hobbes and Locke on one key point, though. In the state of nature, humans have absolute liberty and absolute equality.
Okay, so far so familiar. Where does he diverge?
Pretty much everywhere else. He agrees with Hobbes that natural man lacks social capacity. They're isolated individuals. But he goes further. He says they are utterly amoral and asocial.
Well, social, not antisocial.
Right. Not inherently conflictual, just lacking any capacity for social or political life. And here's a big break from Locke. Rousseau says they are so primitive they cannot even conceive of or obey abstract natural laws or moral rules.
Why not? What's missing?
Language. This is one of Rousseau's most original and kind of startling insights, according to the text. He argues language isn't natural, it's an invention of civilization. Primitive people, without language, simply cannot reason or speak complex thoughts.
And no language means?
No politics, no real community. As Aristotle understood way back, speech is essential for political life. Without it, you can't have a viable community.
Wow. Okay, so Rousseau's natural humans are isolated, amoral, asocial, can't talk, can't really reason. That sounds pretty bleak. Maybe even worse than Hobbes' view. But you said he still disagrees with Hobbes about being a state of war.
He does. He actually agrees with Locke on the result. The state of nature is generally peaceful and harmonious.
But how? If they can't reason or follow natural law like Locke thought.
It's not reason, it's feeling.
Feeling. What kind of feeling?
Pity. Or compassion. The text quotes him from the Second Discourse. Savage man. Tempers the ardor he has for his own well-being by an innate repugnance to see his fellow man suffer. This pity, Rousseau argues, is the only natural virtue.
The only one?
Yes. Everything else, justice, generosity, fairness, these are socially created or conventional. Pity is different. It's pre-rational. It's universal. You even see hints of it in animals. The text mentions his example of a horse avoiding stepping on a living creature. It's a basic natural empathy.
So it's not exactly moral goodness in the way we usually think of it, because that requires reason and speech, which they don't have yet. But it's a kind of fundamental pre-rational concern for others.
Precisely. And this is absolutely key for Rousseau. The text emphasizes that this natural compassion is the foundation for all genuine human virtue. Without it, any rules or virtues created by society are just hollow rules of behavior or vanities.
Like the virtues of the Enlightenment civilization he was criticizing.
Exactly. He felt that civilization, by overemphasizing corrupted reason and self-interest, had lost touch with this fundamental natural feeling. Its virtues had become hollow.
So the source frames Rousseau's state of nature not just as a hypothetical starting point, but as a powerful critique of his own society. It shows how civilization, especially one built on inequality, suppresses this natural goodness.
Right. He's basically saying Hobbes and Locke got it wrong because they didn't describe natural man at all. They described civilized man and projected him backward. The text quotes Rousseau saying they spoke about savage man and they described civil man.
Locke imposed civilized reason and natural law onto them.
And Hobbes imposed the passions produced by civilization, like the lust for power and glory, mistaking the effects of a corrupt society for innate human nature. They failed to see the underlying goodness that society had warped.
Okay, so given this very different starting point, this peaceful but amoral, asocial, nonverbal state of nature driven by pity, why would anyone leave it? Why form a society through a contract?
Yeah, the text notes Rousseau isn't perfectly explicit on the exact trigger. He just says it happens when individual strength becomes insufficient to overcome the resistance of the obstacles to his preservation. What obstacles? Not war or property disputes like in Hobbes or Locke.
So maybe something else.
The text suggests he might be thinking of purely physical threats, like natural disasters. It mentions a passage in his essay on the origin of languages about early humans needing to cooperate to survive floods or earthquakes. But honestly, the real focus for Rousseau, and what's more important for his theory, are the benefits of entering political society.
And the text highlights a truly profound benefit, a transformation. It quotes him saying, "The shift from the state of nature to the civil state produces in man a very remarkable change, by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and giving to his actions a moral character which they lacked before."
This is the core transformation. It's radically different from Hobbes and Locke. For them, the contract is mainly about security. Human nature stays pretty much the same. But for Rousseau, the contract elevates humans. They move from being creatures of instinct and feeling, like pity, to becoming moral beings capable of justice and reasoned action.
This is where they gain moral liberty.
Exactly. Moral liberty, which alone renders a man master of himself, as he puts it in the social contract. Only in society, under the right rules, can humans become truly free by acting morally and rationally, not just on instinct.
So the text is really clear. Despite his harsh critique of civilization's downsides, Rousseau is definitely not some primitivist arguing we should all go back to the woods or idolizing the noble savage as the pinnacle of humanity.
Not at all. Civilized people, under the right kind of social structure, have the potential to be far superior. They can rise above mere animal existence to become moral, choosing beings. It connects back to that Aristotelian idea of political life enabling true human flourishing. His attack is on perverted civilization and perverted reason, not civilization or reason themselves.
And the text also reminds us that the contract itself shouldn't necessarily be seen as a literal historical event.
Right. It's more of an imaginative construct, a way of illustrating how society should be structured to achieve these transformative ends. You can't literally gain language and reason the moment you sign a contract. You'd need them beforehand to even understand it.
So his point is more that language, reason, moral rules, that these are social products. They are acquired in society. Beyond that basic pity, human nature as we know it is largely shaped by our social environment, by our socialization.
Exactly. What we are is largely a result of the society we live in. And the premise of his contract theory, according to our text, is to show that genuine freedom and happiness are only possible in a society that is structured to make reason moral. A society that unites reason with that natural feeling of compassion and, crucially, prevents the gross inequalities that debase people into purely self-interested calculators. That ideal society is what the social contract is meant to create.
Okay, so this leads him right into the central problem of all contract theory. How do you reconcile individual liberty with the need for social order? You give up your natural freedom to obey rules. How can you remain free?
He poses the dilemma himself very starkly. Where shall we find a form of association by which every person, while uniting himself with all, shall obey only himself and remain as free as before?
And you can't just accept the answers Hobbes or Locke gave.
No, he rejects Hobbes' solution, giving all power to an absolute sovereign, because that destroys the individual's moral liberty, the very thing the contract is supposed to enable. But he also rejects Locke's solution of limiting the sovereign's power.
Why? Locke's limiting government sounds pretty good to us now.
Because Rousseau, like Hobbes, sees individuals in the state of nature as fundamentally isolated and lacking natural social bonds. He agrees with Hobbes that unless the sovereign power is absolute, society will just disintegrate into chaos. Locke's limited government wouldn't be strong enough to hold things together from Rousseau's perspective.
So he needs a sovereign as absolute as Hobbes is, but one that doesn't destroy liberty like Hobbes does. That sounds impossible.
It does. But this is where Rousseau makes what our text calls his greatest claim to fame. He finds a way, theoretically, to reconcile absolute sovereignty with absolute liberty. He creates a sovereign just as absolute as Hobbes is, yet argues individuals remain even more absolutely free than in Locke's system.
Yeah, how on earth does he do that?
His solution, as the text details, is ingenious, if radical. First, he agrees with Hobbes. The contract requires the total alienation of each associate and all his rights. Everyone has to give up everything. No holding back natural rights like Locke suggested.
Total alienation. Okay, but doesn't that just lead back to Hobbes?
Here's the crucial twist. You don't alienate your rights to a separate king or assembly standing above you. You alienate them to the whole community. Everyone gives up their rights to everyone else. Each person contracts with all others simultaneously.
So the sovereign power isn't some external ruler. It is the entire community acting collectively.
Exactly. The text explains that the sovereign power resides within the whole community, and every individual citizen is an integral part of that sovereign. Everyone is subject to the laws made by this collective sovereign, yes, but because they are citizens and participate in making those laws, they are ultimately obeying rules they themselves helped create.
Like the example the text uses. If there are 10,000 citizens,
Then each person has a 10,000th part of the sovereign authority, though he is entirely subjected to it. You're both ruler and ruled simultaneously.
okay, so the political consequence is that the power to make laws, the legislative power, must belong to the entire community, meeting together with each citizen having an equal voice.
That's the only way, Rousseau argues, for an individual to obey only himself while uniting with all. By obeying the law created by the collective sovereign of which you are a part, you are obeying yourself. Sovereignty and liberty aren't opposites, they become mutually dependent. True liberty requires this specific form of popular sovereignty.
And the text is careful to point out this isn't just Locke's idea of popular sovereignty in a new outfit.
No, Rousseau actively critiques Lockean liberal democracy. He says Locke might talk about popular sovereignty in theory, but in practice, by giving legislative power to representatives, Locke hands real power over to a minority. The people aren't truly sovereign or free, except maybe for the brief moment they vote for the people who will then rule them.
Okay, but wait. Let's go back to that objection. What if I'm in that sovereign assembly and I vote against a law, but the majority passes it? Aren't I then being forced to obey a law I didn't consent to? My 10,000th part didn't win. How am I obeying myself then?
Rousseau definitely anticipates this. His counter-argument, as presented in the text, is that in a properly functioning, well-organized society, one, based on the principles he lays out, even those who dissent will come to recognize that the law passed by the collective is ultimately for their own good, and they'll obey willingly. However, if a citizen still refuses to obey what the collective has determined is the general will, then, Rousseau says, they shall be compelled to it by the whole body.
And this leads directly to that bombshell phrase.
The one highlighted by the text, yes. This only forces him to be free.
Okay, deep breath. Forces him to be free.
Yeah.
That just sounds wrong. Like something out of Orwell. A total contradiction in terms.
It absolutely does to our modern liberal ears. We're so steeped in a certain way of thinking about freedom that this phrase feels inherently paradoxical, even sinister. But Rousseau believes he's resolved the contradiction, and the absolute key, as our text makes clear, is his concept of the general will.
Okay, we need to unpack that. What exactly is the general will?
It's his term for the sovereign power itself when it's acting legitimately. When the entire community gathers as the legislative assembly, the expression of their collective will or moral sense aimed at the common good is the general will.
And what makes this collective will moral? Why isn't it just, mob rule?
It's generality. This is crucial. The text explains that because everyone participating in making the law, all the citizens in the assembly, is making it for the entire community, including themselves, they have a built-in rational self-interest in making laws that genuinely benefit the public interest.
Because the law applies equally to everyone, including the lawmaker.
Exactly. Remember the contract. You give yourself up to all others. The text quotes that because the condition of every person is alike, it would not be to the interest of anyone to render that condition offensive to others. By vesting sovereign legislative power in the whole community, the individual self-interest of each citizen ideally becomes aligned with promoting the public interest of all.
Okay, so this connects directly back to his opening statement in the social contract, where he talks about uniting what right permits with what interest prescribes, that justice and utility may not be separated.
Precisely. The general will is that merger. Justice, acting for the public good, and utility, acting for one's own self-interest, become one and the same thing. When my rational self-interest is the public interest, unlike in Hobbes's view where they're opposed, then I'll willingly obey the laws we collectively made for our common good. The need for external force decreases, and liberty is maintained.
And the text suggests this alignment goes even deeper, fostering a kind of civic virtue.
Yes, it argues that recognizing your self-interest is the public interest generates a larger love of one's fellow citizens. Properly channeled self-love expresses itself as love of country or patriotism. The general will becomes the political expression of that natural pity or compassion we talked about earlier. Reason and feeling are united. Political decisions become truly moral acts.
Of course, Rousseau wasn't naive about this. The text acknowledges he knew there was a real danger.
Absolutely. The danger is that citizens in the assembly might fail to see that their true long-term self-interest lies in the public good. They might get swayed by short-term gain, factional interests, or just plain selfishness, and vote based on their narrow private will instead of the general will.
And if that happens too often, the community risks disintegrating.
Exactly. Into competing private wills, factions. Reason and feeling become disjointed again, people act purely out of self-regard, and the whole basis for the general will collapses. And the text explains that this inherent risk is why Rousseau insists on such a complete restructuring of society and polity, the small state, equality, censorship, etc., all designed to prevent these particular wills from forming and overpowering the general will.
But even with all that, making every citizen part of the legislature is the absolutely essential first condition.
It is, and the text reiterates a crucial point here. As long as the general will isn't corrupted or alienated, as long as it genuinely reflects that common interest, it remains general and therefore moral. Rousseau claims it is always right, not necessarily infallible in its judgments about how to achieve the good, but always aimed at the public good. It won't consciously choose to harm the community. The text quotes him, "The people are never corrupted, but they're often deceived, and only then do they seem to will what is bad."
Okay, so now, armed with the general will, let's go back to forced to be free. How does the logic work according to the text?
The text lays it out clearly. Step 1. The general will, when properly formed, is morally right because it aims at the common good. Step 2. Disobeying the general will is therefore doing moral wrong. Step 3. The whole purpose of entering civil society via the contract was to achieve moral liberty, to become masters of ourselves by acting according to justice and reason, our true potential as moral beings, rather than being slaves to instinct or corrupted self-interest.
So, step 4. Doing moral wrong, acting against the general will, is not exercising moral liberty. It means you're actually still enslaved maybe by your own ignorance, your passions, your selfish desires.
Precisely. Step 5. Therefore, when the community compels you to obey the general will, it's not actually taking away your true freedom, it's stopping you from acting according to your enslaved, corrupted self. It's forcing you to act in accordance with your own higher, rational, moral will, the will that aligns with the general will. It's compelling you to be the free, moral being you have the potential to be.
So real liberty is obedience to a law that reflects this genuine moral will.
Yes, and the text explicitly labels this a positive theory of liberty. Freedom isn't just being free from external obstacles or restraints. That's the negative theory of liberty we're mostly familiar with from thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, freedom from interference.
Right. Less government equals more freedom, in that view.
Exactly. But positive liberty means being free for something specifically, for achieving your potential as a moral being, for self-mastery, for living according to reason and virtue within a just community. Conforming to the general will, even if you're coerced into it, is liberty in this positive sense, because the general will represents that moral end.
And that's why forced to be free sounds so jarring to us.
Yeah.
Because we're so used to thinking in terms of negative liberty.
That's exactly what the text argues. From the perspective of negative liberty, where freedom is just the absence of external constraint, the idea of the state compelling you for your own good and calling it freedom is completely contradictory, even Orwellian. The goal of the liberal state is generally to minimize law and state power to maximize the sphere of negative liberty.
The text uses that really vivid example of drug addiction to illustrate the positive liberty idea.
It does. Imagine Rousseau's ideal community, through its general will, decides that dangerous drug use is harmful to individuals and the community, so it bans it. This law, we assume, reflects the genuine public good. Now, you have citizens who are addicted. They are, in Rousseau's terms, enslaved by their addiction. Their private will is overriding their rational, moral will and the common good.
And as members of the Sovereign Assembly, they might have even voted for the ban themselves, in a moment of clarity, recognizing addiction is wrong.
Quite possibly. So when the community steps in and compels them to stop using drugs, maybe through treatment programs, maybe even through penalties, it's not just punishment in the way a liberal state might see it. It's breaking the chains of their addiction. It's enabling them to be free from their enslavement, allowing them to act as the ethical, rational beings they truly are, the beings who are aligned with the general will. The community is, quite literally in Rousseau's framework, forcing them to be free.
Whereas in a modern liberal state, drug prohibition is more about public order preventing crime. The focus isn't really on the addict's moral liberation in the same way.
Exactly. The language of forced to be free is just unthinkable from that standard liberal negative liberty perspective.
And the text makes it clear that this positive theory of liberty requires what it calls a positive state.
Yes, a state that sees its role not just as preventing harm or protecting rights, but as actively involved in shaping the moral character of its citizens. It has to act as a moral educator, cultivating the conditions like virtue, patriotism, concern for the common good that allow the general will to flourish. This is fundamentally different from the liberal ideal of a limited, largely neutral state that just referees conflicts between individuals pursuing their own interests.
And Rousseau would argue that those states based purely on negative liberty and self-interest ultimately fail.
He would. He argues that without a sense of shared moral purpose, without a general will, society eventually dissolves into conflict, or it has to rely on sheer power and coercion to maintain order. And relying on brute force, in his view, destroys genuine liberty just as surely as anarchy does. He contends that many modern states, built on what he saw as flawed Hobbesian or Lockean foundations, already rely primarily on force and are thus destroying liberty, whereas his ideal state uses force, paradoxically, only to uphold and enhance true moral freedom.
Okay, so achieving this vision, this state based on the general will and positive liberty, requires a very specific kind of political structure. It's not going to happen just anywhere.
Absolutely not. The text highlights two main organizational principles that Rousseau insists are essential for maintaining the general will. The first, and maybe the most striking, is that the state must be small.
And the main reason for that is practical, so everyone can actually meet.
That's the primary reason. To be the sovereign, the people must be able to physically gather together as a legislative assembly. In a large state, you inevitably have to resort to representatives, and Rousseau is absolutely adamant that representation destroys the general will. Sovereignty cannot be represented, he says. The text quotes him quite bluntly. Quote, "Liberty is diminished by the enlargement of the state."
So smallness isn't just like a nice feature. It's a non-negotiable requirement for his whole system of sovereignty and liberty to function.
Yes, and he argues smallness has other benefits too. It helps foster that intense sense of community that's necessary to keep the general will strong and focused on the common good. When people know each other, live closely together, it encourages mutual care and evokes that natural compassion, that other-regardingness that underpins the general will.
The text connects this to Aristotle again.
Right, the idea that political life, ideally, should engender friendship among citizens. A small community makes that kind of civic friendship more possible.
And smallness also helps maintain what he called simplicity of manners.
Exactly. The text explains that in a small, less complex society, people are less likely to be, well, sophisticated in a bad way. They're less likely to be deceived by factions, special interests, or clever rhetoric that tries to twist their votes away from the genuine public interest. He famously contrasts the supposed wisdom of simple peasants gathered under an oak, making sound decisions for the common good, with the complexity and susceptibility to corruption found in large, supposedly sophisticated nations.
Okay, so smallness is crucial. What's the second key principle? The text says it's even more essential.
Equality. Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
The text quotes Rousseau directly. Liberty cannot subsist without it. We already saw how he argued extreme inequality leads to domination, which destroys both political liberty and the inner moral autonomy needed for the general will to emerge.
But the text is careful to clarify he doesn't mean absolute, like mathematical equality of wealth or power, he's no fanatical egalitarian.
Correct. He defines the necessary equality not as everyone having the exact same amount, but as a condition where, and this is another quote the text highlights, power should never be so strong as to be capable of acts of violence, and that in regard to riches, no citizen should be sufficiently opulent to be able to purchase another, and none so poor as to be forced to sell himself.
So it's about preventing the extremes, preventing the kind of wealth that lets some buy influence or control over others, and preventing the kind of poverty that forces people into desperation and dependence.
Exactly. It's about maintaining a relative balance. The text notes he calls for moderation in wealth and position from the great, and moderation in avarice and greed from the lower classes. Relative, not absolute. Equality is the goal, sufficient to prevent domination and preserve independence.
And the government has an active role in maintaining this balance. It's not just supposed to happen naturally.
Definitely not. The text points to his work, Political Economy, where he argues the government's job includes preventing excessive wealth accumulation. He even suggests it's better to limit people's needs and desires through education and simple living than to rely heavily on taxes to redistribute wealth after the fact. He saw rising taxes as a symptom of a society already becoming too complex, too unequal, and thus undermining the general will.
So his view on economics is very different from, say, Locke's emphasis on unlimited property rights, or the modern focus on GDP growth.
Completely different. Like the classical thinkers, Rousseau sees economics as subordinate to ethics and politics. The goal is the public good, maintaining the conditions for the general will, not just maximizing wealth accumulation. This economic view, the text notes, really implies and requires that small, simple, and essentially agrarian state he favored.
Okay, so smallness and relative equality are the foundations. Beyond that, the text mentions some other specific institutions Rousseau admired or recommended, often drawing on his reading of the Roman Republic, much like Machiavelli did before him.
Yes, he discussed things like the temporary dictatorship for emergencies and the tribuneship to protect the people's liberties, quite technical stuff. But perhaps more illustrative of his core philosophy are institutions like the censorship and the civil religion.
Censorship, that one definitely raises eyebrows today.
It absolutely does, again, because our default is negative liberty, freedom from interference, especially freedom of thought and expression. But the text explains Rousseau's quite different logic. The censorship in his ideal state is established to preserve morality by preventing the opinions of men from being corrupted.
How can opinions be corrupted?
For Rousseau, public opinion, the shared values, morals, and customs of the community, is the most fundamental law. It's the law written within the human heart. If that underlying public opinion gets corrupted, for instance, if people come to widely believe that pursuing individual self-interest is more important than the collective good, then the whole moral foundation of the state, the general will itself, is undermined. So, censorship, in this context, isn't about suppressing political dissent necessarily, but about upholding the shared moral consensus deemed crucial for the public good and the survival of the free state.
Okay, so it's directly tied to maintaining the ethical conditions necessary for the general will and for positive liberty to function. It's part of the state's role as a moral educator.
Exactly. It flows directly from that idea. If the state's purpose is moral education, ensuring subjects' liberty conforms to the general will, then things like absolute freedom of opinion or the unlimited right to accumulate property simply cannot exist if they are seen as corrupting the moral virtue required for the general will. And the same logic applies to his idea of a civil religion.
Fixing religious opinions. That sounds even more controlling.
Well, he argued that religious beliefs, at least those with social and political implications, couldn't be left entirely unregulated. The sovereign should determine a purely civil profession of faith, a set of basic civic beliefs necessary for good citizenship. Things like belief in God, the afterlife, the sanctity of the social contract, and the laws.
Would other religions be banned?
Not necessarily. The text says compatible religions might be tolerated as long as they don't preach intolerance or conflict with civic duties. But the preferred model is this civil religion that integrates political and religious values. The text compares this to Machiavelli's critique of Christianity, what Rousseau called the religion of man, for being too otherworldly, diverting loyalty away from the political community. Rousseau's religion of the citizen, by contrast, is designed to support the state, glorifying it and teaching the patriotic virtues necessary for its survival, rather than focusing on humility or the afterlife.
So all these pieces, the small size, the relative equality, the censorship, the civil religion, They're all designed to work together to create a very cohesive, unified society where the citizens' focus is directed primarily towards the state and the community.
Precisely. The text puts it starkly. This structure directs citizen attention almost totally toward the state. And the intended emotional and psychological outcome of all this is love of country, patriotism.
And patriotism is where it all comes together for him.
Yes. This is where, as the text quotes him saying, patriotism brilliantly combines the force of egoism with all the beauty of virtue. It channels that natural feeling of compassion towards fellow citizens, and it makes promoting the public good feel like an extension of rational self-love. It unites justice and utility, self-interest and virtue. Patriotism, for Rousseau, is the emotional fuel, the very foundation of the general will.
Okay, so that intense patriotism fostered by the structure of the state is what makes the sovereign assembly actually work in practice. Let's look more closely at the mechanics now. The structure of the sovereign itself and its relationship with the government.
Right. The sovereign, as we've established, is the entire body of citizens meeting together as a legislative assembly. Its sole purpose is to express the general will. The text outlines some basic rules for this assembly.
Like meeting regularly.
Yes, it must meet periodically and also whenever there's a crisis. And crucially, the frequency of these meetings needs to be adjusted based on how powerful the government is.
Why does the government's power affect how often the assembly meets?
Because, and this is a huge point for Rousseau that the text emphasizes, the executive power is inherently dangerous to the sovereign. He says the government makes an unremitted effort against the sovereign, and that this tendency towards usurpation is an innate and inevitable vice of all political systems. It will eventually destroy the social contract if not constantly checked.
Wow. Why is the government inevitably dangerous?
Because, unlike the general will of the whole community, the government itself is a smaller body with its own interests, what Rousseau calls a particular will, or a group will. And unlike the private will of an individual citizen, or even a small faction, the government's group will has real power behind it. The power to enforce laws, control administration, use force. This makes it the most dangerous particular will in the state, constantly tempted to assert its own agenda over the general will and take over the sovereign's legislative functions.
So the government is necessary to execute the laws made by the sovereign, but it's also inherently corrosive to the sovereign itself. That's a fundamental tension.
It is. Like Plato seeing an inevitable cycle of decline in political regimes, Rousseau believes the best you can do is try to forestall the inevitable disintegration caused by the government's ambition. And the way you do that is by carefully structuring the government to find the right balance between its necessary force and its dangerous group will, the balance that is most advantageous to the state. The initial founder or lawgiver of the state has the crucial task of getting this balance right.
Okay, and how is that balance struck? The text mentioned adjusting the number of officials.
Yes, Rousseau lays out a kind of inverse relationship. The more magistrates or officials you have in the government, the weaker its collective group will becomes. It's harder for a large group to agree and act decisively, and thus the less power it can effectively wield against the sovereign or the citizenry. Conversely, the fewer magistrates you have, the stronger and more unified its group will becomes, and the more powerful the government is.
So the most powerful government is a monarchy, one ruler.
Exactly. The group will is basically the private will of the monarch, making it highly unified and capable of wielding maximum force. The weakest government, in this sense, would be a direct democracy where the government is composed of almost all citizens, its group will is diluted, easily confused with the general will, and less efficient in execution.
What's the logic there? Why is a bigger government weaker?
The text explains Rousseau's thinking. Larger governing bodies require more internal negotiation, coordination, and effort just to function and make decisions. More energy is spent internally, leaving less energy or force available to exert outwardly on the citizenry or against the sovereign. Smaller governments have an easier time coordinating internally, leaving more force available for external action.
Okay, so which form of government is actually best, according to Rousseau?
It's not one size fits all. It depends entirely on the circumstances of the state, particularly its size, wealth, and complexity. His rule of thumb, derived from this logic, is the larger and wealthier the state, the stronger the government needs to be to manage it effectively, meaning fewer magistrates leaning towards monarchy. The smaller and simpler the state, the weaker the government can and should be, meaning more magistrates leaning towards democracy.
And this connects back to why he dislikes large states and monarchy.
Precisely. They require a powerful executive government which, by its nature, poses the greatest threat to the general will and the liberty of the sovereign people.
And the text outlines the specific forms he considers.
Yes. For extremely small, simple states, direct democracy, where the people both legislate and execute, might be compatible. But Rousseau actually isn't a huge fan. He thinks it confuses powers, it's not the natural order for the majority to govern the minority in execution, and it's rarely practical unless the people are exceptionally simple and virtuous.
What about the other end? Large, opulent states.
For those, monarchy, the most powerful government, is the most compatible form, technically speaking. But again, he dislikes this intensely because of the inherent danger the monarch's powerful private will poses to the general will.
So what's the sweet spot? His ideal.
His ideal form of government, suited for those middle-sized states that are moderately wealthy and extensive, is elective aristocracy.
Aristocracy. That sounds surprising.
Elective aristocracy, importantly. Not hereditary. He means government by a small group of the best elements, those chosen for their wisdom, talent, and virtue. He saw this as the best balance, neither too large and ineffective like democracy, nor too small and dangerously powerful like monarchy.
But the text makes a crucial clarification here, right? He prefers an aristocratic government, but not an aristocratic state.
Absolutely essential distinction. The state, the locus of sovereignty, the general will, belongs entirely to the whole people and must be expressed democratically in the sovereign assembly. His ideal state is thoroughly democratic in its foundation, even if the day-to-day executive tasks are handled by an elected aristocracy.
And like Aristotle, he recognized that reality is messy.
Yes, the text notes he acknowledged that most real governments are somewhat mixed, and that tailoring the specific mix to the circumstances that the climate, geography, resources, history of a people is necessary. He quotes Montesquieu approvingly. Liberty not being a fruit that every climate will produce, it is not within the abilities of all peoples.
So the wise leader adapts the ideal.
Exactly. You aim for the ideal described in the social contract, but you have to work with the reality you have. Other works, like his advice for the government of Poland, show him suggesting practical adaptations, like using federalism to create smaller, more communal units within a large nation, trying to mimic the benefits of smallness. The goal is always the best government possible under existing circumstances, trying to approach the ideal as closely as conditions permit.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. The text argues that beyond all these specific structures, Rousseau's broader philosophical aim was really to expose what he saw as the fallacies of Enlightenment thinking and the inadequacy of modern values, which he believed were destroying true freedom.
Right. He wasn't just trying to build a logically consistent political system. He was mounting a fundamental challenge, seeking a thoroughgoing reaffirmation of classical ideals.
And the text highlights several of those classical connections.
Yes. His distinction between the ideal state and the best possible state echoes Plato's Republic versus his Laws. His admiration for Roman institutions and emphasis on patriotism recalls classical republicanism, like Machiavelli's reading of Rome. But the most central classical link, the text argues, is his general will itself, with its focus on the small city-state actively engaged in the moral education of its citizens. That mirrors Aristotle's view of the polis and the importance of direct, active citizenship.
And maybe the biggest classical throwback, the insistence on the unity of ethics and politics.
This is absolutely key, as our text emphasizes. For classical thinkers, politics and ethics were inseparable. The purpose of the state wasn't just order or security. It was to cultivate virtuous citizens and achieve the common good. Modern political thought, really starting with Machiavelli and developing through Hobbes, Locke, and later liberals, increasingly separated ethics from politics. The focus shifted purely to power, how to acquire it, how to manage it, how to limit it as the fundamental basis of the state.
And the text suggests the rise of the large impersonal nation-state made this shift almost inevitable.
Plausibly, yes. These large states lacked the natural sense of community needed for a shared ethical purpose. So, modern theorists focused on power as the only realistic basis for holding such diverse entities together.
But Rousseau saw this focus on power as a huge mistake. He thought they mistook the effect for the cause.
Exactly. Modern theorists, especially Hobbes, with his mechanistic view of humans as driven by appetite and aversion, thought power was necessary because people were inherently self-interested. Rousseau flips this. He argues it was the very existence of power structures divorced from ethical goals and the corrupting social conditions these structures created, like inequality, that turned naturally compassionate people into self-interested calculators. Power didn't just respond to human nature, it actively corrupted it.
So for Rousseau, authority power grounded in a legitimate moral claim, like the general will, isn't just more politically effective in the long run, it's actually necessary for human well-being.
Absolutely. The text calls legitimate authority the necessary precondition for human integrity and happiness. In states based purely on power and coercion, where people obey out of fear or calculation rather than a sense of shared purpose or public good, they lose their moral autonomy. They cease to be truly free agents, become alienated from their natural goodness, lose both inner and political freedom. Authority, rooted in a shared moral will, brings integrity and happiness. Power alone brings debasement and chains. This profound human cost is why he felt compelled to look back to classical ideals.
But here's the fascinating paradox our text keeps coming back to, the thing that makes Rousseau so complex and enduringly relevant. His ideal state looks classical in its form, small, communal, focused on virtue, but his underlying philosophical assumptions are thoroughly modern.
Right. This is his unique power. He uses modern assumptions to challenge modern beliefs, which is why his contemporaries couldn't just dismiss him as irrelevant.
What are those modern assumptions?
First, like Hobbes and Locke, he accepts that the state is conventional, created by human agreement, the contract, not natural as the classical thinkers believed. And second, and crucially, the moral basis of his state, the general will itself, is ultimately a product of that conventional contract.
Meaning it's not based on objective, universal moral truths.
Exactly. It's an expression of the subjective values, the shared moral sense of a particular community at a specific time. It doesn't derive from universal standards like Plato's forms or the traditional concept of natural law, which Rousseau largely rejects as knowable or binding.
The text says he goes even further than many of his contemporaries in rejecting that older natural law tradition.
He does. He effectively argues that moral values and rights, at least in the political sphere, are conventional, created by the culture of a specific society. Think about property rights again. For Locke, property is a natural right existing before government. For Rousseau, it's a conventional right, granted by society through the general will, and therefore society can legitimately limit its accumulation for the common good.
So he kind of agrees with modern social science, or relativism, in seeing laws and rights as socially constructed.
In a way, yes, laws and rights are socially determined. But, and this is crucial unlike thinkers who might then conclude that ethics are therefore meaningless or purely subjective, Rousseau doesn't deny the reality or validity of ethics. He tries to reaffirm ethics, to give them a powerful role in politics, but on this new conventional foundation. The unity of ethics and politics is classical in form, but its substance, the general will derived from the community's particular values, is modern. The general will is a modern idea dressed in classical clothing.
And this central concept, the general will, while it's the source of his fame and influence, is also the main target of criticism, as the text explores.
Indeed. The text covers both practical and theoretical criticisms. The practical one is fairly straightforward. Critics argue his ideal state, small, simple, agrarian, demanding intense civic participation, just wouldn't work in a large, complex, diverse, modern nation-state. It's impractical, maybe even irrelevant, a throwback to the Greek polis.
But the text pushes back on that a bit.
It does. It argues that dismissing it as impractical misses the point. Rousseau's ideal functions as a powerful standard by which to critique existing modern states. The social contract isn't just a blueprint, it's fundamentally a critique showing the inadequacy of the nation-state, how its scale and impersonality inevitably prevent the formation of a true general will, replace authority with power, and ultimately debase human beings. It's part of his larger assault on Enlightenment, optimism, and modern values.
Though the text does concede that trying to apply Rousseau's ideals directly to a modern nation-state as it exists now, that could be dangerous.
Yes, it acknowledges that given the reality of large, diverse, impersonal modern states, attempting to enforce the kind of moral unanimity Rousseau envisioned, or literally forcing men to be free in that context, would likely have totalitarian implications. It would require almost total political control to even attempt it. And this practical danger, the text notes, is a strong reason why many people ultimately find Locke's model of limited government preferable, despite its own flaws.
But the text adds a caveat to the totalitarian label.
Right. It reminds us that critics who simply label Rousseau a precursor to totalitarianism often forget that his ideal state was fundamentally different in scale and structure from the modern nation-state where such policies would indeed be oppressive. Applying his solutions outside of his very specific context is problematic.
Okay, let's move to the theoretical criticisms, which the text suggests are perhaps more fundamental.
These center squarely on the general will itself. The main charge is that it's just too ambiguous as an ethical ideal. It lacks clear substance or content. How do you know when you've actually found it? We saw that majority vote doesn't guarantee it. Even unanimity doesn't guarantee it's the general will rather than just the will of all, the sum of private interests. The moral basis remains fuzzy.
And the text identifies a couple of key reasons for this ambiguity.
First, because it's socially relative. If the general will is just an expression of the particular values of a specific community at a specific time, then by definition it lacks definite, universal content. This attempt to base ethics purely conventionally, the text argues, ironically risks leading back to a kind of ethical relativism. Second, it's ultimately rooted in feeling in that natural compassion or pity rather than purely in reason. And feeling, while important, is inherently subjective and difficult to translate into clear, logical, unambiguous rules.
Although the text does give Rousseau some credit on the feeling point.
It does. It suggests Rousseau was right to see that ethics aren't only rational, they have an essential emotional component, like pity or empathy. He correctly identified a gap in modern science and Enlightenment thought, which tended to ignore or downplay emotion. Many modern complaints about the coldness or impersonality of contemporary life echo Rousseau's concern.
But there's a rebuttal to that, too.
Yes. The text asks whether Rousseau perhaps became too pessimistic about reason's role and too optimistic about feeling's capacity to ground morality. While purely rational ethical systems like natural law might be flawed or even invalid, as Rousseau believed, and many moderns agree, feeling alone might yield standards that are too subjective, too ambiguous to effectively guide a political community. Rational standards, whatever their flaws, at least aim for explicitness, logic, and universality. Rousseau, the text suggests, fundamentally shatters the optimism in reason alone that had founded so much of Western political thought.
And the final point of criticism the text mentions is the potential danger lurking in this emphasis on feeling.
Right. While rational theories might not hold up, relying too heavily on feeling without a strong rational framework carries the risk of irrationalism. The text briefly notes how certain strains of 19th century Romanticism, which drew inspiration from Rousseau's focus on emotion and authenticity, may have inadvertently paved the way for later, more fanatical ideologies that prioritized collective feeling over individual rights or rational deliberation.
Yet despite all these serious criticisms, the practical challenges, the theoretical ambiguities, the potential dangers, the text concludes that Rousseau undoubtedly has the mark of a truly great political thinker.
Why? Because the criticisms he provokes, the debates he sparks, take us to the very heart of his political theory and raise the perennial political issues. Whether you end up agreeing with him or vehemently disagreeing, wrestling with Rousseau forces you to think deeply about the most fundamental questions of politics, freedom, authority, community, human nature from fresh perspectives.
And in doing so, he powerfully illuminates some of the core contradictions and tensions within Western political thought itself. The text lists them. The tension between ethics and politics, sovereignty and freedom, the individual and the state, the enduring clash between classical ideals and modern realities.
He embodied these contradictions in his own life and work, and his ambitious, flawed, but brilliant attempt to overcome them continues to raise the key issues and make us think anew about what it truly means to be free in a political community.
Wow. That was certainly a deep dive into some incredibly complex, challenging, and often unsettling ideas. We've journeyed from Rousseau's initial startling claim that we are everywhere in chains, explored his diagnosis of how inequality and a perverted civilization forged those chains, and then really wrestled with his radical solutions centered on that powerful but tricky concept of the general will and the notion of being forced to be free.
You've seen his vision for a very specific kind of society, small, equal, virtuous, built on authority and intense patriotism. And we've also grappled with the significant criticisms his ideas have faced, especially around the ambiguity of the general will and those totalitarian concerns.
He really forces you to look beyond the surface, doesn't he?
Yeah.
To question your own assumptions about what freedom really is. Is it just about not being told what to do, that negative liberty? Or is it something more profound, maybe something tied to our moral capacity, our potential, and the health of the community we live in?
Absolutely. He makes us confront that perpetual tension between our individual desires and the needs of the collective, the role of emotion versus reason in politics, and the powerful, maybe uncomfortable way our social and political structures shape who we fundamentally are.
And as we wrap up this exploration, let's leave you with that provocative question that really echoes throughout his work, drawn right from our source material. If Rousseau is even partially right, that the very structure of our civilization, its inequalities, its focus on self-interest, can corrupt our natural goodness and pervert even our reason, making us, as he so vividly put it, love our slavery. What does that mean for us today? Are we truly free? Or are we perhaps still wearing those garlands of flowers over chains we've simply learned not to see? Something to keep thinking about.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.